come and share a little bit this morning. I've been very blessed in what God has allowed me to I've had to do the last few years in balancing between my work at Pittsburgh State University with our campus ministry there that I lead, but also in kind of a new endeavor for me with Open Door Libraries. I'm going to share a little bit about that, but I just want to touch on something. This was not in my notes, but something that, as John was mentioning, the stuff that's going on in India. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been kind of concentrating in our campus ministry about the persecuted church. And so we have shared a documentary, and I've preached, and I've shared some other things about what's going on. And we are just so fortunate that we drove here this morning and we safely walked in. And there is just a lot that's going on in the world right now that we can't even fathom. And maybe that's okay. There are so many believers that are going to church in secret, that are sitting in churches that are tucked away in attics and in basements and in underground areas. And there's just a lot of pain in their physical life. But I want to say this. I've been very fortunate to travel into some of those regions over my life. And one thing that I have noted is that they may be pain physically, but they're blessed spiritually. And I just want us to continue to remember the persecuted church, remember their plight. That's a little bit of why I have got connected not only to campus ministry, but to the ministry of Open Door Libraries, is going to the places where not many are brave enough to go, but they go into the places and taking the gospel message of Jesus. And I say that genuinely. In my journey, I had worked in a couple of established churches and was pretty comfortable in my lifestyle. And then it was about a little over 6 years ago that God began stirring in my heart. And I didn't know where that stirring was going to take me, but I kind of sat down with God and had my list of all the places that I wanted to go. I was currently living in the Tampa Bay area and working in an established church there. I'd done youth ministry there for a number of years, was working in a different position at that point. And I began listing out the places that I thought God should send me. And I had this list, and I had some categories of what I wanted to be doing. And I kind of came to the conclusion that somewhere in this, I really saw God leading me either into doing church planting or into missions. And I had gone to some conferences, and I had sought out some encouragement, some counsel from some other friends of mine in ministries and in different areas. And there was one place that I said I was never going to go, which is, we all know, you don't say that to God. But I said I would not move back to the Joplin area. That was just not on my list. That was not where I wanted to be. In March and April of 2009, some people had invited me to come back. I said, no way, I'm never going to do that, or may I move back, which was not on my plans. But here's what I want to say in this, is our plans, they're nothing compared to God's plans for our lives. And it doesn't matter what stage in life we're in, or where we're going, or what it is that we're envisioning doing. When God has something in plan and in motion for you, we need to listen. Because as Jonah, who did not listen, realized the alternative was not good. And so though I said, even a couple of weeks before I moved back to Missouri and took a job in Kansas, that I was not going to do that, God had already been preparing and laying some things in my life for that. And I'm just so thankful, because it allowed me to take students with me into countries all across the globe. I've led, I think, 9 or 10 international trips in the last 5 years with our students at Pittsburgh State. This last summer, we saw 33 of them go out to serve either in foreign missions or in the church over the summer. I've got to watch students that have stepped onto the field part-time and full-time. I've watched students that came to our university with one idea and left with a whole vision for what God had for their lives. I've seen countless students that have come to know Jesus for the first time, or the first time that they really took it seriously. And I've been very blessed because I listened. I can remember as I was taking some of our students, we were in Jordan, which is right smack dab in the middle of all the conflicts. Jordan's neighbors are Israel and Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, just to the south of Egypt, and just a bit of the ways over is Lebanon. And so there's constantly things that are going on. I had taken some of our students to Jordan just a couple of summers ago, and we were in this refugee camp. And we had gone and we were teaching them songs, and we were telling them Bible stories, and we have to be a little bit careful because it is a Muslim area, but they've said as Americans, as visitors, as Christians, you can come, you can share some songs and some stories, and just tell them about God's love. And so we did. And we spent a couple of hours out there. And prior to this, we have a partnership in Jordan, and there's a lady who oversees a couple of NGOs, non-government organizations, and they go into these refugee camps. And so my friend Vera and I were kind of mapping out what that day was going to look like. And so she gives us a list of all the names of the children and how old they are. And so we go out and we buy gifts for them. And they're nothing huge, but some coloring books with some crayons and some markers and a ball and some candy and some other just small things. And we put them in these big, kind of big Ziploc bag style things. We figured they were big, and so it fit everything in it, but they could be used by their moms later. So we left in there some gifts for their family as well, some tea and some snacks and some rice and different things like that. We left some food as well. But we had all these bags basically numbered. We had these for boys that were in this age group, these for girls, and all these different things. So we're going through, and they're calling out the names, and they're checking out that is the right kid, and they're giving them a gift. And then I noticed I can feel this little tug right here in my pocket. And there's this boy, maybe 10, 11 years old, and he's tugging on my pocket. He's going, Mister, Mister, Mister. That's about all he knew in English. And I said, no, it's okay. And I shared a little bit in Arabic and English, that he had a gift. It was okay. Don't worry. He kept tugging, Mister, 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 Mister. Here's what. I had noticed him as we were playing games and as we were spending time with the kids, and when he and about 4 or 5 other boys had come from just a little bit away from this makeshift tent camp. And they've been kind of getting in and singing songs and things like that and playing the games, but there were these men who I didn't know if they were their dads or their uncles, and kind of just been pushing away. And they looked like they were maybe trying to stir up a little bit of trouble, but they didn't seem like they were doing much. But I thought, I don't know these kids. Sometimes 10, 11-year-old boys are a little mischievous. Maybe they've gotten in trouble. Maybe they've been doing some stuff and they were told that they couldn't do it. But I noticed them, and then I'm noticing this tug. And so I call over one of our translators because I want to make sure I understand what's going on. And they said, no, they're not on the list. That's what he's telling you, that they're not on the list and they're not going to get anything because they live in the little camp over this way. And in Jordan, they've welcomed so many refugees. And there are authorized camps. And then some of those get a little bit violent at times. And so this group of people, about 60 families, had moved into their own settlement, which meant they no longer qualified for any funding from the UN. They no longer were guaranteed any opportunities for their kids. They couldn't work, but it was safe, and they wanted their kids to be safe. And then from that, at the top of a small hill, there were maybe 9 or 10 other tents. And this was families that had just recently moved in, and they weren't really officially a part of this camp. And so that meant that their kids weren't on the list, and they weren't going to get anything. And these families weren't on the list, so they didn't get food the next day either. And so this boy, in his desperation, is begging of me to give him something. And I asked, I said, can we do anything? I said, no. We have enough for everyone. Well, the day before, when we were putting these bags together, I said to our students, just in case, let's make a couple extra bags. I said, I don't know if we're going to need them, but somebody can use them. And so we put in some extra things. And just in case, we purchased a few extra things of food that we wanted to be there for those families. And so I said, well, we've got some extra stuff. Is there any way we can do this? No. They'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Well, I worried about it. It broke my heart because I watched what was happening. Here was a young boy who had lost everything once at least. So you can tell what time of the year these families fled their country by what their clothing was. We were there in July. Yet there were kids with long sweaters on, and they had on heavy wool pants. You could tell that they left everything they had behind but those few items of clothing. And these boys had a variety of clothes on. None of them really fit them, and so I knew they had left everything. Maybe had grown a bit, were getting some hand-me-downs from somebody, or maybe just grabbed what was in the closet, whether it fit or not, and ran out and escaped violence. So here's a boy who has lost security, and he comes and he finds a little bit of a refuge, a little bit of time to just be a kid, and now we have to tell him, sorry, there's not a gift for you. And so they explain to him, and they tell him, there is nothing, you must go. So he turns, and he was the first to come, and he was the first to leave, and he starts to run away. And I don't know what to do at this point. So I stop our interpreter, and I said, we have some extra gifts. Is there any way that we can give him something? And so we pool together our resources, and they call out to him. And he stops. And he's a good 50, 60, maybe even farther yards ahead of us. And he stops. And they tell him what's going on. And he turns around. And he's running as fast as he can. Hair flying back. And I noticed tear stained all over his face. Tear stained eyes. When we give him this gift, and he can't stop thanking us. And he's trying not to express his tears, and we're trying not to completely show ours. But we had a chance to bring hope to a boy who hope was not in his vocabulary. He had to grow up really, really fast. He had left behind family and friends. He had left behind a room with toys and things in it. He had left behind security, and he was in a dirt-filled area with a makeshift tent that was made out of sugar sacks and out of whatever random things they could find. I don't know when the last time he had a real bath was. I don't know the last time he had a real meal. But for that moment, he had a little bit of hope. Why we take people on these trips, why I'm a part of not only Campus Christians at Pittsburgh State University, but Open World Libraries out of San Jose, California, is because we know that in human terms, that hope comes in a sack with some toys and games and coloring book. But what really comes is the message of Jesus. Our world needs hope. Our world needs just the security that comes in Christ. And the world out there, the secular world, is doing everything they can to destroy the message of Jesus, everything they can to push back Christians. And Christians are saying, you can kill me, you can take away my home, you can take away my job, you can beat me, you can do whatever you want, but I'm not going to give up the message and hope of Jesus, because he's just too important. I wonder if we have that same passion. I wonder if when we read the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, a section of Scripture that probably has been memorized by many of you. I know for me it was a passage we learned every year in church camp and every year in VBS. It's a passage that has affected me more and more every day of my life. Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, tells his disciples this: I've given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach the new disciples to obey all commands they give me. And be sure of this: I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. We talk about the Great Commission plenty of times. We'll talk about the fact that we're to go. And yes, we're to go into our neighborhoods and our communities. We're to go into our jobs, into our schools. We're to go into this area around us. But Jesus says that we're also to go. In another section it says that we'll go to Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and all of the lands. We say it a lot, but do we live it a lot? You see, too often we take our faith and we're very passive about it. We come and we consume and we go home. And now we have our Bibles and we celebrate Christmas and Easter, and we love the hymns that we sing, and there are certain Bible verses that really stick out to us. But do we take the message of Jesus as a command, as a literal command to go into all of the world? I've learned on our university campus that the world is coming to us, so I tell my students regularly, this is our world, go into it. And they do. But I also take them and partner them with organizations globally so they can understand how different this world is compared to Kansas. It's pretty easy to be a follower of Christ in Kansas. It's not as easy when people are knocking on your door and arresting you, when you're being thrown in prison because of your faith. But again, I come back to the last half of this. I think for a lot of life, I remember the first few parts of it, go into all the world and to make disciples. I didn't always know what that meant, but I figured to tell them at least about Jesus. And I understood baptizing them, and I had been to enough weeks of church camp, and even in youth ministry, had stood in swimming pools and church camps and had baptized kids. But when I realized that there was more to it, when I began to understand this true discipleship, of letting them know that a true disciple of Jesus is one who will go with him to the very end. Jesus went to the cross. We need to be willing to go. He says, take up your cross and follow me. I began to understand what that meant. When I began to start teaching and traveling into the Middle East and to other parts of more hostile lands, and I began hearing stories about people who had been arrested and thrown in prison, whose lives were threatened, and knew that if they ever went back to their home country, they would lose their life again. If they ever went back into that village, into that community, their life would cease to exist. There were death warrants out there. But yet, this is what they often reminded me. But Jesus said, I'm with me. I'm with you. I'm with you to the very end. And they would sit and they would tell me, but God's with me. What do I have to fear? And they would tell about how they had these plans to go back and to share in their communities, and to go back and to share their faith with their family. And they knew that death may be the result, but it was okay with them. Because they understood that Jesus said it's not going to be easy, but follow my example. Go where I send you. Some of the opportunities that we have through the ministry of open door libraries, I encourage you to come over and to kind of look at some of the things that we have over there, and let me answer some questions. But we have the opportunity to go into people's lives in a very unique way. What we do as a ministry is we go to where people are, and we begin to place books into their lives. You see, open door libraries began in its early days going into the communist nations behind the Iron Curtain. They began going in and sharing about Jesus to people who had been told that there is no Jesus, there is no God. And they wanted to make sure that those few remaining believers had resources, and they had books, and that churches could continue. And so they did things underground. And then as communism fell, they began to look at how do we reach people. There are few, if any, people in this world that do not understand the key and the hope that comes from education. And so they began to start these resource centers. And they began to place books into people's lives, because even if they didn't want to hear about Jesus, if they had a chance to read a book, and they had a chance to become better educated, and they had a chance to learn conversational English, in communist nations, in war-torn regions, they see that as a way out, as a glimmer of hope. And so we've gone in and we began to place books into people's lives. And from that, people are beginning to hear the gospel message. One of our sites, I shared this in Sunday school, one of our sites in Hungary, they started establishing churches out of this library, this small little flat in downtown Budapest. And they started establishing churches, and these are not Hungarian churches, these are churches of Kenyans and Nigerians. Kenya and Nigeria are sending lots of people to Hungary, into Eastern Europe to get education, because the doors are a little bit more open for them there than they would be in England or in the United States or in some of the other Western European countries. And so they started sending people there. And so these groups of Nigerian believers are coming together and they're starting a church. And then they're beginning to bring their friends, their classmates, their co-workers that don't know anything about Jesus. And so then from one church they're starting another and another and another. And so we have churches that are starting out of our libraries. In the Middle East, we are partnering with local organizations. And we are really looking at creative ways as these people that are refugees are coming in and looking for some sort of an answer and some sort of a hope. We're beginning to place that in their hands. One of the things that has always stood out to me is just how different the relationships in the Middle East are between a Muslim and a Christian. The reality is that they really don't have much of a relationship. But we're starting to build some bridges where Muslims are coming together with Christians, and Christians are sitting down with Muslims, inviting them into their homes, and are beginning to live out and share the message of Jesus. We're watching as people that are dressed in traditional Islamic and Arabic wear are coming through church doors because they've sought out help in the government, they've sought out help in the local imam in the Muslim mosque, and they've all said no and they've turned away. There's some Christians that have stepped up and said, "You're welcome. You're welcome to come in. Your kids are welcome to come here. Let's teach them. Let's educate them." Many of them aren't able to go to school, and so we're starting some programs out of the library with local churches to make sure that kids are getting the education that they're reading, that they're hearing about things. And with that, of course, their hearts are open to the gospel. You see, we've said, those Muslim countries, they must be just full of evil, and there is evil. There are horrible things that I've seen and heard. But there are people like you and me that want to watch their families sit around a table and share a meal, that want to watch their kids grow up in safety, that want a better life, and as they're fleeing a war-torn nation and coming into a place where there's peace, they're open. Because they know the answer isn't in war, and they're beginning to learn the answer isn't in religion. And they want to learn about this Jesus that they've heard glimpses of, but they want to learn about a relationship. Because Christians are different. Because they'll say, you act different than the people in my community. Why is that? And that's our daily. Let me tell you about Jesus. In Romans chapter 12, Paul understood a little bit about this as he was reaching out to the Christians in Rome. There was all sorts of sin and all sorts of struggle and all sorts of persecution going on and more to come. But he's saying to those early Christians that you have to live differently. That you have to live in a different light than the rest of your community. You have to give up certain things. That you have to act in a different way. That you have to speak in a different way. That you eat different foods. That you just handle yourself different. And one of my favorite verses in Scripture is this, out of Romans chapter 12. It says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God, because of all that He has done for you, and let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind who will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of the world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn, or then you will know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Paul said to those early Christians that they needed to be a living sacrifice. That meant that every day they needed to give their all to God. That they needed to live differently than the world around them. To not just come to church on a Sunday or whatever day they were worshiping. And many of these house churches were meeting at different times and in different places. He's saying it's not just about coming to the building. It's not just about coming to the table and sharing a meal. It's about living differently and giving your all to God. And when we understand what it means to be a living sacrifice, a sacrifice of giving everything to God. You know, they understood a sacrifice. They understood that you took the sheep and you slaughtered it. You took the lamb, the goat, the chicken, the cow, whatever it was. They got sacrifice. They understood you split a neck, the blood poured out, and you gave it back to whatever God you worshiped. To the Jews, it was to Yahweh. To many of the people in Rome, it was to whatever God they followed. But Paul is saying to not just to Rome, but to us, that you're willing to let yourself die, so to speak, so that you can live for Jesus. We understand that in baptism. That you're buried in that water, that you're getting rid of the old self and coming up a new person. Paul's saying, you've got to give your all. As we've been spending time working among various believers and non-believers in the Middle East especially, we've begun to realize what it means to truly sacrifice.